Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back 4.5 millennia to the sun-scorched sands of the Giza Plateau. We're standing at the foot of the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, staring up at a monument so vast, so impossibly perfect, it seems to defy its own existence. You could almost feel the heat radiating off the stones, a heat that has baked these sands for ages. Let's be honest, your first day on the job here, 4,500 years ago, would almost certainly be your last. Your flimsy linen kilt and lack of SPF 5000 would be no match for this environment. And that's before we even start talking about the actual work. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to see where in the world you're joining me from tonight and what time it is for you. Post your city in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your feet sink slightly into the warm, pale sand. Before you, the Great Pyramid of Khufu doesn't just rise. It commands the very sky, a mountain of honey-colored limestone under the piercing blue canvas of the Egyptian heavens. It's made of some 2.3 million stone blocks, a fact you can't really comprehend until you're standing here, feeling utterly insignificant next to just one of them. The sheer scale is dizzying. The base alone covers 13 acres. You could fit several cathedrals inside it. But it's not the size that's the real mystery tonight. It's the story of how it got here. Close your eyes for a moment. What image does your mind conjure up? Go on. Let the popular version of history wash over you. You probably see a line of thousands upon thousands of men, their backs scarred and bent, their faces etched with misery. You hear the rhythmic grunt of effort, punctuated by the sharp, cruel crack of a leather whip. You see stern-faced overseers in chariots, their expressions merciless as they drive the human herd forward. This is the image we've been given. The epic tale of a tyrannical pharaoh, a man named Khufu, who enslaved a nation to build his own glorious tomb. It's a story of immense suffering, of human beings treated as disposable beasts of burden, their lives sacrificed for a single man's vanity. This is the mirage, the powerful, heartbreaking illusion that has shimmered over the Giza Plateau for centuries. Now, open your eyes again. Look at the real stones. Run your hand over the surface of one of these massive blocks. It's solid, ancient, and real. And something about that brutal whips and chains narrative just doesn't feel right. It feels too simple, too convenient. The construction is too precise, too masterful. Originally, this entire pyramid was encased in highly polished, white Tura limestone, fitted together so perfectly that you couldn't slide a knife blade between the stones. On a bright day, it would have gleamed, reflecting the sun's rays like a divine beacon, visible for miles. Would a demoralized, brutalized slave workforce, driven only by fear, truly be capable of such breathtaking artistry and precision? It seems unlikely. Today, the biggest challenge here is getting a photo without 100 selfie sticks in the background. Back then, the challenge was just, not getting crushed by a 2-ton block of granite before lunch. This is where our real investigation begins, by questioning that first automatic image in our heads. We're here to look past the mirage and find the truth hiding in plain sight. The truth of who these people really were. How many were there? Well, that's our first puzzle. Historians still argue whether the workforce numbered in the tens of thousands or topped 100,000 strong during the peak construction season. The sheer logistics of housing, feeding, and organizing that many people are mind-boggling, regardless of their status. And as we stand here, dwarfed by this monument, the silence of the desert seems to hold its secrets tight. But the story isn't entirely lost. The clues are here, buried under the sand, etched in the rocks, and waiting in the bones of the very people who achieved this impossible feat. The story we've been told is a powerful one, But it's time to see if it's the true one. That feeling of doubt you have, standing there on the sand, is the first crack in a very old, very thick wall of misinformation. And the cement holding that wall together isn't just ancient dust, it's celluloid. Let us leave the Giza Plateau for a moment and step into a different kind of temple, a darkened cinema from the 1950s. You sink into a plush velvet seat. The air is thick with the smell of buttered popcorn and anticipation. On the giant screen, bathed in glorious technicolor, a scene of biblical proportions unfolds. It's Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. You see Charlton Heston, jaw set heroically, looking on as thousands of extras, stripped to the waist. And glistening with theatrical sweat, haul massive, perfectly square prop stones up a ramp. The orchestral score swells with dramatic violins and looming horns, telling you exactly how to feel. Outrage at the injustice, sympathy for the suffering. This is where the modern myth was truly forged and mass-produced. For millions of people, this was the historical record. These epic films were the original viral videos, shaping the collective consciousness of generations. They were so visually stunning, so emotionally compelling, that the images they presented became facts. The close-ups on tormented faces, the crack of the overseer's whip cinched perfectly by a Foley artist. The sheer spectacle of it all, it's powerful stuff. It's also almost entirely wrong. You have to admit, it's a much better movie this way. A story about a well-compensated, seasonally employed civil engineering corps just docent to have the same dramatic punch as a slave revolt led by a future prophet. The slaves in these movies also have remarkably good teeth and smudge-free makeup, which is the first clue that you're watching fiction, not a documentary. The biggest deception, however, is a simple matter of chronology. The most influential source for the slave narrative is the Old Testament story of the Hebrew people enslaved in Egypt. But here is the crucial fact. The events of the book of Exodus are traditionally dated to the New Kingdom, likely under a pharaoh like Ramesses II, around 1300 BC. The Great Pyramids of Giza were built during the Old Kingdom, around 2550 BC. That's a gap of more than 1,200 years. Conflating the two is like saying the Romans who built the Colosseum were enslaved by Napoleon. The timeline simply doesn't work. The people in the Bible story, if they were historical figures, would have been looking at pyramids that were already ancient ruins, 1,000 years older than their own story. But Hollywood didn't invent the myth. It just gave it a global platform and a soaring soundtrack. The idea of the pyramids as monuments to cruelty is much older. In the 19th century, for example, a strange field of study called pyramidology became popular. Adherents believed the pyramid wasn't a tomb at all, but a divine prophecy machine built by someone other than the Egyptians, perhaps by Enoch or even Job from the Bible. They meticulously measured the lengths of corridors and the dimensions of chambers, believing they could find coded timelines of biblical history and predictions for the future. It's a classic example of people projecting their own beliefs onto these silent structures. They couldn't imagine the pagan Egyptians building something so perfect, so they invented a story that fit their worldview. And that's the real power of the slave myth. It's a simple, satisfying story. It has clear villains and clear heroes. It's a morality play written on a colossal scale. The truth, as we are beginning to see, is more complex and in many ways far more interesting. Scholars still debate the extent to which ancient popular narratives, passed down through generations, influenced the accounts of later, more formal historians. Did stories told around campfires slowly become accepted as historical fact, repeated until they were written down as truth? It's a cycle we still see today. A dramatic headline, even if corrected later, is what sticks in the mind. The story of suffering is simply more memorable than the story of organized labor. And so, as the film ends and the lights come up, you're left with those powerful, enduring, and incorrect images. To find the real source of the story, we have to go back much further than Hollywood. We have to find the first person who wrote it all down, history's first great storyteller, and perhaps its first great embellisher. You step out of that darkened cinema, leaving the flickering images of Hollywood behind, and travel even further back in time. The year is now roughly 450 BC. You're standing on the dusty banks of the Nile, not as a pyramid builder, but as a tourist. The pyramids he's staring at are, to him, more than 2,000 years old. They are as ancient to him as the Roman Colosseum is to us. Commanding her to charge a certain fee and to ask each client to donate one stone block towards her father's pyramid. He was the primary written source, and he said the pyramids were built by a suffering populace under a tyrant. This is the seed that grew into the slave myth we know today. His work was copied by later Greek and Roman writers, and eventually his version of events became the accepted truth. But just like with the Hollywood films and the Bible stories, there's a huge problem: the timeline. Herodotus is reporting on events that happened 2 millennia before his time, based on hearsay. It's history written from folklore. While his contribution is monumental, relying on his account alone is like trying to understand modern physics by reading only Greek philosophy. He provided a starting point, but a flawed one. To find the truth, we can't rely on storytellers, no matter how influential. We need to find physical proof. We need to trade the papyrus scroll for a trowel and start digging. And that's exactly what happened in the late 20th century, when a chance discovery in the sands just south of the Giza Plateau would finally give the builders a voice. The story is salacious, memorable, and paints Khufu as a monster of cartoonish villainy. It's a fantastic story, but it's almost certainly propaganda, likely passed down by Egyptians who lived centuries after Khufu and viewed the era of massive pyramid building as one of hubris and hardship. Historians still argue whether Herodotus understood the nuance of the Egyptian language and culture, or if he was simply at the mercy of his local translators and their tall tales. He can't just dig up records or interview an eyewitness. All he can do is talk to the people on the ground, the temple priests, who hold the sacred knowledge, and the local guides, the dragomans, who make their living telling stories to curious foreigners like him. And oh, do they tell him some stories? You can almost see the scene. A wily guide, a glint in his eye, realizing he has a very eager, and perhaps slightly gullible, audience in this inquisitive Greek. The perfect mark for a tall tale, an ancient tourist. Beside you is a man with an insatiably curious mind. He tells the world that the Great Pyramid was built by the pharaoh, Khufu, whom he calls Cheops, a cruel and wicked king. He writes that Khufu closed the temples, cast all the Egyptians into misery, and compelled them to work for him. He claims a workforce of 100,000 men toiled in 3-month shifts. He even puts a price tag on the operation. His most famous quirky tidbit is the story of an inscription on the pyramid itself. He claims his guide translated it for him, revealing that the pharaoh had spent a staggering 1,600 talents of silver just on radishes, onions, and garlic to feed the workforce. You can picture Herodotus's eyes widening as he jots this down, a perfect concrete detail to make his story pop. Modern scholars, however, have never found this inscription. Most believe it either never existed, or more likely, his guides were just having a bit of fun with him. It is the ancient equivalent of selling a tourist a genuine piece of the Berlin Wall that is actually just a bit of gravel from the parking lot. And what we would today call a notebook and pen in his case, a scroll of papyrus and a reed brush. This is Herodotus of Halicarnassus, a Greek traveler who was in the process of inventing an entire field of study, history. He is, in many ways, history's first great influencer, traveling the known world, interviewing locals, and compiling everything he sees and hears into a massive work called the Histories. Egypt, to Herodotus, is already a land of staggering antiquity. Herodotus, diligently scribbling, reports what he is told as fact, and his account is incredibly specific. His narrative gets even more scandalous. Herodotus claims that when Khufu ran out of money, he did the unthinkable. He sent his own daughter to work in a brothel. The influence of his account cannot be overstated. Because Herodotus was the father of history, his word was taken as gospel for over 2,000 years. You leave Herodotus and his sensational stories behind, letting the ink on his papyrus fade into the long twilight of history. For centuries, his version of events reigned supreme. But now, you jump forward to the late 1980s. Literally, her horse's leg sinks into the sand, revealing the edge of a mud brick wall. It's an accident, a random bit of luck that changes everything. To one side, you see the remains of what archaeologists call the galleries. You can see the circular bases of the bread molds, known as bedya, still lying in the ashes. You see the remains of large clay pots used for mixing dough. Nearby, you find the remnants of a brewery. These weren't just for a few people. These were industrial-scale operations. Archaeologists estimate these bakeries could produce thousands of loaves of bread every single day. This is the evidence of logistics, of a system designed to feed a massive and presumably valuable workforce. These are enormous, elongated buildings, almost like barracks. These structures are a primary piece of mainstream historical fact discovered at the site. They were clearly meant for housing a large number of people. Each gallery could likely sleep around 40 to 50 men, and they were built to a standardized design. It was communal living, but it was organized and permanent. This wasn't a temporary shantytown thrown up to house disposable people. This was infrastructure. It was a planned settlement built by the state to support the most ambitious construction project in human history. The man who investigates is the famed Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass. He clears away the sand and realizes this isn't just another wall. It's a tomb. But it's not a royal tomb. Was it a bustling, permanent city year-round? Or was it more of a seasonal hub that swelled to capacity when the Nile's annual flood brought a fresh influx of temporary workers? The layout suggests different zones. The long galleries might have been for the rotating, temporary laborers, while separate, more comfortable houses may have been for the permanent, skilled artisans and their overseers. There's even evidence of a command center, a large administrative building where the entire project was managed. The discovery of this city fundamentally shifted the conversation. The question was no longer, were they slaves? The evidence here screamed, no. The new question became, who were these respected, well-fed, and highly organized people? The lost city provided their address. Now we just need to get to know the residents. It's small, modest, and located in what would later be called the Lower Cemetery. As his team begins to excavate, they find inscriptions. The tomb belongs to a man named Parashepsu, and the inscriptions say he was a director of the craftsmen and an overseer of the artisans. This is it. The first tangible, undeniable link to the men who orchestrated the building of the pyramids. The air on the Giza Plateau is different. It's thick not just with sand. The excavation expands, and soon it's clear this is not just one tomb, or even a small cluster of them. It's a vast necropolis, a city of the dead, reserved specifically for the pyramid builders. But if there's a city for the dead, there must have been a city for the living. And just a short distance away, under layers of sand and debris, they find it. You are now walking through the ghostly outlines of what archaeologists have named Hayt el Gorab, the lost city of the pyramid builders. This is not a slave camp. There are no shackles, no guard towers, no signs of confinement. Instead, you see the foundations of houses, bakeries, breweries, and workshops, all laid out in an organized grid, but with the exhaust fumes of tour buses and the constant chatter of 1 million visitors. You are no longer an ancient tourist, but a modern observer, watching as the suburbs of Cairo creep ever closer to the sacred ground of the pyramids. The world's focus has always been on the colossal tombs of the pharaohs themselves. The lives of the people who actually built them were considered unimportant, a footnote in the grand story of kings and gods. No one had ever systematically looked for them. Then, one day in 1990, a tourist on horseback stumbles. This discovery opens a new door, not into the afterlife of a king, but into the lives of his people. As you explore, the evidence paints a surprising picture of life here. You wander down a long, paved street. You duck into the ruins of one of the smaller buildings and find something even more mundane, and yet more profound, a bakery. But scholars still argue about the true nature of this settlement. You're standing at the edge of the newly discovered workers' village, the lost city, as the first rays of dawn spill over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air is cool and still. It's 4 a.m., 4,500 years ago. The silence is broken by the gentle stirring of a city coming to life. This is where you get to see the real pyramid builder, not as a faceless cog in a machine, but as a human being with a routine, a family, and a very, very early alarm clock. There are no gongs or whips to start the day. There is only the quiet, collective understanding that a monumental task awaits. You follow a man named, let's call him Many, as he emerges from one of the long gallery barracks. He's not a slave in rags. He's a farmer from a village hundreds of miles down the Nile. For 9 months of the year, he tends his fields. But for these 3 months, during the annual inundation, when the Nile floodwaters cover his land, he is here. It's his civic duty, his national service, and a chance to earn credit with the gods and the pharaoh. He wears a simple linen kilt, practical for the heat that will soon descend. His first stop is the bakery. The air here is already warm and thick with the smell of yeast and wood smoke. Many receives his ration for the morning, a couple of dense, nutritious loaves of emmer wheat bread and a large jug of beer. This isn't the beer you'd get at a modern bar. It's thick, porridge-like, and packed with calories and nutrients, more of a food than a drink. It was the Gatorade of ancient Egypt. He eats his breakfast as he walks, joining a river of thousands of other men heading towards the looming shadow of the pyramid. There's a low hum of conversation. They talk about their families back home. They grumble about a particular foreman. They make jokes. This isn't a death march. It's the morning commute for the world's most ambitious construction crew. They are divided into teams, and Many's crew is heading to the limestone quarry at Giza, right next to the construction site. His job today is not one of delicate artistry. It's about brute force, leverage, and teamwork. The foreman gives the day's instructions. They need to detach a new block from the quarry face. The process is grueling but ingenious. Using copper chisels and stone pounders, they painstakingly carve a series of channels and slots into the rock. This is slow, arduous work. The copper tools are soft and blunt quickly, requiring a team of smiths to be on hand, constantly resharpening the worn-out implements. Once the channels are deep enough, they insert wooden wedges into the slots. This is where the real cleverness comes in. They soak the wedges with water. The wood swells, expanding with immense, slow-moving force until, with a great groan and a shudder that you feel in your teeth, the multi-ton block of limestone splits from the bedrock. There's a cheer from the crew. It's a small victory, but a crucial one. Now comes the transport. Using ropes made of papyrus and flax, and leveraging the sheer manpower of dozens of men, they maneuver the block onto a wooden sledge. There are no wheels, no cranes. Just muscle, sweat, and a shared rhythm. They pour water on the sand in front of the sledge to reduce friction, a small detail confirmed by an ancient tomb painting. The foreman chants, setting a pace. He aved hu. He vet hu. It's a hypnotic, unifying sound. You notice the camaraderie. Men watch out for each other. A slip here could mean a crushed limb, or worse. Scholars still debate the exact number of men required to move a standard 2.5-ton block, with estimates ranging from 20 to 50 men, depending on the incline and the surface. But everyone agrees on one thing. It required absolute synchronized cooperation. The sun is high and merciless now. The men glisten with sweat, their backs aching. But at midday, there's a break. More bread, more beer, maybe some dried fish or a handful of dates. They find shade where they can, resting their weary bodies before the afternoon's work. This is the 4 a.m. grind, ancient style. It's backbreaking, relentless, and dangerous. But it is not slavery. It's a national project, fueled by bread, beer, and a sense of collective purpose. As the day wears on, Manny and his team will transport several more blocks, their bodies screaming with effort. But they are building eternity. And for that, they are paid, fed, and as we are about to see, even given boastful, slightly ridiculous nicknames. You're still there with Manny and his crew, sweat stinging your eyes as you help haul another block away from the quarry face. The sheer monotony of the work is staggering, a relentless cycle of hard labor under the Egyptian sun. They are broken down into smaller and smaller units, creating a clear hierarchy. The entire workforce was divided into two massive crews, perhaps named for the two halves of Egypt, upper and lower. An archaeologist shines a light on a patch of red ochre paint, faded but still legible after 4,500 years. The inscription reads, "The drunkards of Menkaure." You have to chuckle. Menkaure was the pharaoh who built the third and smallest of the Giza pyramids. His project was happening concurrently with, or just after Khufu's. This gang was clearly so proud of their work, and perhaps their off-duty antics, that they named themselves after their royal patron and added a bit of flair. This graffiti, known as work gang graffiti, is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for a paid, organized workforce. Other team names that have been discovered include the Friends of Khufu and the Followers of the Powerful White Crown of Khufu. It's like a corporate softball team today, naming themselves the Google Go-Getters. It shows a sense of belonging and even affection for the project and the king. These were then subdivided into smaller groups called Za, the ancient Egyptian word for a phyle or tribe. Were they assigned by officials or chosen by the men themselves? The informal, boastful nature of names, like the drunkards of Menkaure, strongly suggests the latter. It points to a culture of friendly rivalry. You can imagine the teams competing against each other. Who can quarry the most blocks in a day? Who can haul their sledge to the base of the pyramid the fastest? These competitions, fueled by pride and team spirit, would have been a powerful motivator, far more effective than the lash. The graffiti acts as an ancient attendance sheet, a time card signed with a flourish. In the relieving chambers above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, the name of Pharaoh Khufu himself is found, scrawled by the workers. This directly links the construction to the king it was built for, refuting any fringe theories that the pyramid was built by aliens or a lost civilization. Each Za had about 1,000 men. But it didn't stop there. They are part of the vigorous gang, or the enduring gang. They have an identity. They have rivals in the crew, working on the other side of the pyramid. They are tired, yes, but they are also proud. They are part of something enormous, and their small contribution is immortalized in their team's name, hidden in the heart of the structure they are creating. They've earned their dinner. And as we're about to see, dinner on the Giza Plateau was a perk worth working for. The Zay were then broken down into divisions of about 200 men, which were in turn split into teams of around 20. This is the crew Manny belongs to. It's a cellular, almost military-style structure that ensures every single man knows his role, his foreman, and his immediate teammates. It's a system designed for maximum efficiency and control. No one gets lost in the crowd. It would be easy for morale to plummet, for the thousands of men to become a disillusioned, disorganized mob. These teams, these small gangs of 20 men, were allowed to give themselves names, and their choices have been found scrawled as graffiti on the very blocks of the pyramids, hidden away in interior chambers, never meant to be seen again once the monument was sealed. These aren't the markings of slaves. Slaves don't get to name their teams, and they certainly don't get to tag their work with pride. These are the scrawls of proud workers, leaving their mark for eternity. And the names they chose are fantastic. They are boastful, swaggering, and sometimes just plain weird. But the Pharaoh's project managers were brilliant organizational psychologists. They understood that to motivate men to perform a nearly superhuman task, you needed more than just bread and beer. You needed structure, identity, and a healthy dose of competition. As you look around, you notice that the men aren't just one giant, anonymous mass. This is where things get fun. You stumble upon a block deep inside the Queen's Chamber of Khufu's pyramid. Scholars still debate the full social significance of these names. So as Meni and his team finish their shift, they are not just an anonymous clump of laborers. The sun finally dips below the horizon, and a wave of relative cool washes over the desert. The day's work is done. You follow the river of men back from the pyramid base to the village of Hayt el Gorab. The mood is lighter now. The tired grunts of labor have been replaced by the weary but relieved chatter of men heading home. Your back aches in sympathy, and all you can think about is food and drink. Meni and his crew, the proud drunkards of Menkaure, are heading for the evening meal, and you're about to audit their compensation package. Forget gold coins or silver pieces. Currency, as we know, it didn't really exist in Old Kingdom Egypt. The entire economy was based on a barter and redistribution system controlled by the state. And the pharaoh paid his debts. You enter a large open-air courtyard near the galleries. The smell of roasting meat, a rare luxury for a common farmer, fills the air. This is payday. The state-run bakeries and breweries are working overtime. Remember the thousands of loaves of bread and the thick, nutritious beer we saw this morning? That was just the start. That was the basic wage, the fuel to keep the engine running. What you're seeing now is the bonus, the premium payment for their hard labor. Archaeologists excavating the workers' village have unearthed a staggering quantity of animal bones, and the analysis of these bones tells a story all on its own. Dr. Richard Redding, an archaeozoologist who has spent years studying these remains, has found that the workers were being supplied with enormous quantities of meat. His team has excavated over 1 million animal bones from the site, revealing a diet rich in protein. We're talking cattle, goats, and sheep. And this wasn't just scrap meat. The bones show evidence that they were receiving the prime cuts, the juicy legs, and meaty ribs. In ancient Egypt, meat, especially beef, was a luxury item typically reserved for the elite and for religious festivals. A common farmer like Meni might only eat beef a few times a year. Here at Giza, he's eating it regularly. The analysis suggests that enough cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered at the site to feed thousands of workers' meat every single day. This is not the diet of an enslaved or subjugated population. This is the diet of a valued, high-performance workforce. You don't waste prime rib on a slave. You give them gruel. You watch as Meni receives his ration, a hefty portion of stew, thick with beef and vegetables, several loaves of bread, and of course, a generous jug of beer. This diet was carefully planned. The bread and beer provided the essential carbohydrates for energy, while the meat and fish provided the protein needed to build and repair muscle tissue after a day of hauling stone blocks. It was a scientifically formulated high-performance diet 4,500 years ahead of its time. It's also a logistical miracle. Supporting a city of this size required a supply chain that stretched the length of Earth. Egypt, herds of cattle were driven hundreds of miles from rural estates in the Nile Delta to this spot in the desert, all to feed the men building the pharaohs' tomb. It represents an immense national investment. There is still scholarly debate, however, on how the rations were distributed among the different classes of workers. The skilled, permanent craftsmen and their overseers likely received better quality and larger quantities of food and beer than the temporary, seasonal laborers like many. The evidence from the lower cemetery, where the more modest tombs are, versus the upper cemetery with its more elaborate structures, suggests a clear social hierarchy. This hierarchy was almost certainly reflected in the pay stubs, or in this case, the dinner bowls. This wasn't a completely flat, egalitarian system. Your rank determined your reward. As you look around at the men eating, you realize the genius of the system. This wasn't just payment. It was a symbol of the pharaoh's divine providence. He was not just their king. He was their provider, ensuring they were stronger and better fed here than they were in their own villages. This fostered loyalty and a sense of reciprocal obligation. The pharaoh provides for us, so we will build for him. It's a powerful social contract. Forget the image of a man cracking a whip. The real symbol of the pyramid builder's motivation might just be a sizzling beef rib, but the ultimate proof of their respected status wasn't what they ate for dinner. It was where they were laid to rest for eternity. The satisfying meal of beef stew and bread is finished, and a sense of calm settles over the workers' village. You've seen how these men lived, how they were organized, and how they were fed. But to truly understand their status in Egyptian society, you have to look beyond their life on earth. In ancient Egypt, your burial was the single most important event of your existence. It was your gateway to the eternal afterlife, and the care and resources put into your tomb were a direct reflection of your importance and social standing. For a slave, a proper burial was out of the question. Slaves were property. They would be disposed of in an unmarked pit in the sand, if they were lucky. Now, you walk away from the living quarters of Hayt el Gorab and climb a gentle slope towards the cemeteries you saw earlier, the silent cities of the dead that mirror the city of the living. This is where the story gets personal. This is where we move from the grand scale of the pyramid to the intimate details of individual lives. The first thing you notice is the location. These tombs are built in the shadow of the Great Pyramids themselves. This is prime real estate, a sacred space reserved for those with a deep connection to the royal project. To be buried here was an incredible honor. The pharaoh was granting his workers the ultimate perk, a prestigious spot in his own royal necropolis, allowing them to share in his journey to the afterlife. You enter the upper cemetery, the area reserved for the more senior artisans and overseers. The tombs here are remarkable. They are not simple pits in the ground. They are carefully constructed, miniature versions of the tombs of the nobility. You see small rectangular structures called mastabas, built with limestone blocks and mud brick. Some even have their own tiny cult chapels, complete with false doors for the spirit of the deceased to pass through and receive offerings. You duck inside one belonging to an overseer named Neferteth. The walls are plastered and painted with scenes from his life. He is shown inspecting a building project, his wife and children by his side. There are inscriptions that list his titles and express his devotion to the king. This is a mainstream historical fact that cannot be overstated. The builders were granted custom-built, decorated tombs. These were men of status. You wander over to the lower cemetery, where the common laborers, like many, would have been buried. The tombs are smaller and more modest, some shaped like beehives or small pyramids, but they are tombs nonetheless. Each man was given his own distinct, individual burial. You see bodies laid to rest in a fetal position, facing east towards the rising sun, a traditional Egyptian burial practice. They are buried with grave goods, pottery jars that once held bread and beer for their journey to the afterlife, simple tools of their trade, and sometimes a personal item like a clay figurine. This is the clearest evidence imaginable that these were not slaves. They were respected citizens, granted the full funerary rights of an Egyptian. You don't give a slave food for the afterlife. You don't care if their spirit is nourished. In one tomb, a particularly poignant discovery was made: the skeleton of a man buried with his set of builder's tools, a copper chisel, and a small stone hammer. It was his identity, the thing he was most proud of, and it was buried with him for eternity. One of the more quirky and touching tidbits discovered is that some of these tombs were clearly built by the workers for each other. You can see differences in skill level. An expert mason's tomb might be perfectly constructed, while his neighbor's might be a bit more crudely built, as if his friends pitched in to make sure he got a proper send-off. It speaks volumes about the community they formed here. But the final, irrefutable proof lies in the inscriptions on the tombs themselves. The titles are proudly displayed for all to see: Director of the Draftsmen, Inspector of the Masons, Overseer of the west side of the pyramid. These are job titles, not brands on a slave. They had careers. They had pride in their work. Egyptologists still argue over the precise translations of some of these titles and the exact nature of the social hierarchy they represent. But the conclusion is inescapable. The men who built the pyramids were buried with honor, right beside the magnificent structure they helped create. They were not a forgotten, disposable workforce. They were an integral part of the pharaoh's eternal plan. Their lives mattered, and so did their deaths. But the story of who built the pyramids isn't exclusively a man's story. Hiding in the shadows of the supply chain were the unsung heroes of Giza. You've walked with the men, seen them work, and honored them in their tombs. It's an overwhelmingly male-dominated picture so far: the quarry gangs, the haulers, the masons. But as you look closer at the fabric of life in the workers' village, you begin to see the threads that held it all together. And many of those threads were held by women. For every man hauling a stone block, there was a vast support network operating in the background, ensuring that the primary workforce could function. The Grand Pyramid project would have ground to a halt without the crucial, often invisible, labor of women. Let's step back into the village of Hayt el Gorab. The air is once again filled with the aroma of the bakeries, but this time you pay attention to who is actually doing the work. While some men were involved, tomb paintings and archaeological evidence suggests that food preparation, especially baking and brewing on a domestic scale, was predominantly women's work. You see women grinding the emmer wheat on stone querns, a physically demanding task that required hours of back-and-forth motion. You see them mixing the dough, tending the fires, and pulling the finished loaves from the hot ceramic molds. The same goes for the beer. They were the brewers, mastering the fermentation process that created the calorie-rich slurry that fueled the entire operation. They were the caterers for this massive undertaking. Their work didn't stop at the communal bakeries and breweries. While the temporary laborers, like many, were single men living in the barracks, the permanent, skilled artisans and overseers, the men buried in the upper cemetery, lived in the village with their families. You wander into the residential district, away from the galleries, and peer into the ruins of a family home. Here, you would have found a wife managing the household. She would be raising their children, mending clothes, and preparing the family's supplemental meals. The state provided the basic rations, but families would have added to this with their own garden plots or bartered goods. But women's roles extended far beyond the domestic sphere. One of the most concrete pieces of evidence for women's direct involvement comes from the discovery of female skeletons in the workers' cemetery. This was a game-changing find. Not only were women present at Giza, but some were also granted the honor of being buried in the sacred necropolis alongside the men. Analysis of their bones reveals something fascinating. Their vertebrae and joints show signs of intense physical labor, similar to the men. This suggests they weren't just sitting at home. They were part of the economic engine of the city. What were they doing? A quirky and often overlooked possibility is their role in manufacturing. The project required a colossal amount of peripheral materials. Tens of thousands of ropes, woven from palm fibers, flax, and papyrus, were needed to pull the sledges and hoist the stones. These would have frayed and snapped constantly, requiring a continuous supply. Weaving and rope-making were skills traditionally practiced by women in ancient Egypt. It's highly probable that there were workshops in the village where women sat for hours, spinning fibers and braiding them into the strong cables that were the lifeblood of the construction site. They also would have been weaving the linen for clothing and the baskets used to carry everything from food to debris. Scholars still debate the full extent and official capacity of female labor on the Giza Plateau. Were they officially part of the state-run system, receiving their own rations, or were they primarily there as part of a family unit, contributing their labor indirectly? The presence of female skeletons in the official cemetery strongly suggests the former for at least some of them. They were recognized as contributors, vital enough to be granted an eternal resting place near the pharaoh. We even have some of their names from tomb inscriptions, women like Hetet and Meresenk, who were buried with their husbands. They were not just the wife of so-and-so. They were individuals who lived, worked, and died at Giza. So the next time you picture the pyramid builders, don't just see the men straining with ropes. Picture the women grinding the grain, brewing the beer, weaving the ropes, and raising the next generation in the shadow of the greatest construction project on Earth. They were the silent partners, the logistical backbone, the unsung heroes whose contributions made the entire endeavor possible. Their work was just as crucial as hauling the stones, and it was just as physically demanding. And when those men got injured on the job, as they so often did, they were met with a level of care that is, frankly, shocking for the ancient world. The image of women weaving ropes and men grinding grain adds a new layer of humanity to the lost city. But with all this grinding, hauling, and quarrying, another, more painful reality was a constant presence: injury. In an environment where multi-ton blocks of stone were being moved with little more than ropes and muscle, accidents weren't just common. They were inevitable. A slipped rope could mean a crushed hand. A toppling block could mean a broken leg. In the brutal whips and chains version of history, an injured worker is a useless worker. They would be left to die, a drag on resources, their body quickly swallowed by the desert. But that's not what happened at Giza. Not even close. You return to the workers' cemetery, but this time you're with a team of paleopathologist scientists who study disease and trauma in ancient skeletal remains. They are the ones who can make these old bones tell their stories. As they carefully examine the skeletons of the pyramid builders, a consistent and astonishing pattern emerges. These men and women suffered a huge number of traumatic injuries. They have skeletons riddled with the evidence of a hard life: compressed vertebrae from carrying heavy loads, arthritis in their joints, and most tellingly, broken bones. But the amazing part isn't that they got hurt. It's that they got better. You watch as a scientist lays out the bones of a man's forearm. There's a clear, gnarled line where the bone was once snapped in two, but it's a clean line. The two ends of the bone are fused back together, almost perfectly aligned. This is a healed fracture, and it didn't heal by accident. A break like this, left on its own, would have healed poorly, leaving the arm mangled and useless. The fact that it healed so well is undeniable proof of sophisticated medical intervention. This man's arm was set by a doctor, likely immobilized, with a splint made of wood and linen bandages, and he was cared for during the weeks or months it took to mend. He was out of the workforce, unable to contribute, yet he was still fed, housed, and treated. This is ancient workers' compensation, and it's a level of care that utterly demolishes the slave myth. Case after case reveals the same story. Archaeologists have found skeletons with legs that were broken and then set so expertly that the person would have been able to walk again, perhaps with a slight limp. They've found crushed finger bones that healed. They even found one man who had his arm amputated below the elbow. The bone shows signs of healing after the surgery, meaning he survived a procedure that, even a few hundred years ago, was incredibly risky and often fatal. They weren't just patching people up. They were performing complex surgeries. You don't waste a skilled surgeon on a slave. You invest those resources in a valuable asset. The most startling and quirky tidbit to come from Egyptian medicine is evidence of brain surgery, or trepanation. While we don't have a confirmed case directly from the Giza Workers' Cemetery yet, skulls have been found at other ancient Egyptian sites, with holes carefully drilled into them. In some of these skulls, the bone around the edge of the hole is smooth and rounded, a clear sign of healing. This means the patient survived the operation for months or even years. Why they did it is a mystery, perhaps to relieve pressure from a head injury or to let out evil spirits. But it shows a stunning level of anatomical knowledge and surgical nerve. It's one thing to set a bone. It's another entirely to cut a hole in someone's head and have them live to tell the tale. It was probably a good idea to check your health insurance coverage before agreeing to that particular procedure. Of course, paleopathologists still debate the finer points of this ancient medical system. What did they use for anesthesia and pain? Relief? The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text from a later period, but likely containing much older knowledge, mentions using honey as an antiseptic and willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin for pain. But for something like an amputation, did they have stronger sedatives, like extracts from the poppy or mandrake plant? Or did the patient simply have to be held down while they grit their teeth and endured it? We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that their success rate was remarkable. The evidence is written in the healed bones of the very people who built the pyramids. They were part of a system that valued them enough to patch them up and send them back to work, or at least let them live out their days in peace. And this system had a genius way of keeping the workforce numbers high, even with all these injuries. The existence of a highly skilled medical corps at Giza makes perfect sense. These workers, especially the permanent masons and artisans, were valuable assets, the product of years of training. You couldn't just replace them easily. But what about the thousands of temporary laborers like many, the men providing the raw muscle? How did the pharaoh's administration ensure a massive, continuous supply of manpower for a project that spanned decades? The answer wasn't coercion. It was a brilliant manipulation of the clockwork rhythm of the Egyptian world. The Nile. You are now standing on the banks of the great river, the lifeblood of Egypt. For most of the year, its waters are contained, flowing north towards the Mediterranean, leaving vast strips of fertile black land on either side. This is where 99% of the population lived and farmed. Their entire existence was dictated by the river's cycles. But for 3 to 4 months every year, something magical and transformative happened. Beginning in late June, driven by monsoon, rains in the Ethiopian highlands, the Nile would swell and overflow its banks, covering the farmland in a life-giving layer of water and silt. This was the Akad, the season of inundation. For Egypt's farmers, this was a time of forced vacation. Their fields were underwater. They couldn't plow, they couldn't sow, they couldn't reap. They were, in effect, an enormous unemployed workforce. And an idle workforce can be a dangerous thing for any ruler. So, the Old Kingdom pharaohs devised a masterful solution. They created what was essentially the world's first national service program, a seasonal temp agency run by the state. During the Akhet, when they couldn't work their own land, a significant portion of the male peasant population was called up for state labor. This system is known as the corvée. You can picture the scene. A royal administrator arrives in Meni's village. He has a list. Names are called. Meni is chosen, along with a dozen other young men from his community. It's not a surprise. It's an expected part of life. For the next 3 months, he will work for the pharaoh. His family will be provided for from the village's surplus, and he knows that his service earns him social and spiritual credit. The corvée system is a well-documented historical fact referenced in official texts and tomb inscriptions for centuries. It was the engine that powered all of the state's major construction projects, from temples to canals to, of course, the pyramids. This system had several advantages. First, it provided a massive influx of labor precisely when it was needed. Second, the timing was perfect for transportation. During the inundation, the floodwaters of the Nile reached much closer to the Giza Plateau. A quirky but brilliant detail is that archaeologists have discovered the remains of a major port and system of canals right at the base of the Giza Plateau. This meant that heavy materials, like the massive granite beams for the king's chamber, could be quarried hundreds of miles away in Aswan, loaded onto barges, and floated almost directly to the construction site. The seasonal temp agency arrived at the same time as the heavy-duty building supplies. It was a logistical masterstroke. Historians still argue, however, about how voluntary this system truly was. Was it a beloved civic duty, a patriotic act that farmers eagerly joined? Or was it an inescapable obligation, a tax paid not in grain but in sweat and muscle? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. For many, it was probably a bit of a drag, taking them away from their homes. But it also offered benefits. Remember the diet of beef and fresh bread? That was a significant upgrade for a peasant farmer. It was also a chance to see a different part of the country, to be part of something grand and eternal, and to build a connection with the divine pharaoh. Evading the corvée was likely possible, but it would have come with social stigma and perhaps punishment. It was a duty, but one that came with perks. This seasonal pulse is what allowed the pyramids to be built. A core group of perhaps 5,000 permanent skilled workers, the masons, architects, toolmakers, and doctors lived at Giza year-round. Then, during the flood season, the site would swell with an additional 20,000 or more temporary laborers, who provided the brute force needed for quarrying and hauling. When the floodwaters receded and it was time to plant the fields again, they would go home, and the pyramid site would shrink back to its core population. This cycle repeated year after year for the 2 decades it took to build the Great Pyramid. It was a sustainable, brilliant system that marshaled the entire nation's strength in harmony with the rhythm of the river that gave it life. And every single stone they moved presented its own epic journey. You're standing now not at Giza, but 500 miles to the south, in the quarries of Aswan. The heat here is even more intense, the landscape more rugged and primal. This is the source of the beautiful pinkish-red granite that was reserved for the most important structural and sacred parts of the pyramid, the massive roof beams of the king's chamber, and then the sarcophagus itself. The limestone for the pyramid's core could be quarried right next door at Giza, but this special stone had to undertake an epic journey, a logistical puzzle of staggering complexity, following a single one of these megaliths from here to its final resting place is a story in itself. Your attention is on a single colossal block of granite. It's not a 2.5-ton cube like the limestone blocks. This one is a monster, destined to be a lintel or a ceiling beam. It weighs 50, even 70 tons. That's the weight of a modern battle tank. How in the world do you detach something like that from the earth? The technique is different from the limestone quarrying. Copper chisels are useless against the incredible hardness of granite. Instead, you see teams of men using dolerite, a type of stone that is even harder than granite. They are methodically pounding the rock, chipping away at it, creating a trench around the block. The sound is a deafening, rhythmic clatter of stone on stone. This isn't the work of a few hours, or even days. It would have taken months, an army of men working in shifts, to painstakingly liberate this single megalith. Once the block is finally free, the real challenge begins. How do you lift a 70-ton object? One of the most mind-bending, but accepted facts of Egyptian engineering is their mastery of leverage and patience. They would have used massive wooden levers, wedging them into cracks and slowly, painstakingly, inch by inch, raising one side of the block just enough to shove some rubble underneath. Then they'd do the other side. Over and over again, they would build up a ramp of earth and stone right under the block until it was high enough to be maneuvered onto a truly enormous wooden sledge. The amount of timber required for this alone, in a country as sparse with trees as Egypt, was a logistical feat in itself. You follow the sledge as it's pulled by hundreds of men, their bodies straining in unison, away from the quarry and towards the banks of the Nile. The journey is short, but perilous. Finally, it reaches the water's edge. There, waiting on the river, is the key to the whole operation, a massive barge. A quirky and fascinating detail comes from a papyrus discovered in 2013 at a site called Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea. This is the diary of Mirror, an official who managed a team of boatmen during the reign of Khufu. It's the only known first-hand account from the time of the pyramid construction. Mirror describes his crew's work, which included sailing to the Torah quarries, loading limestone blocks onto their boat, and delivering them to Giza. While he transported limestone, not granite, his diary confirms the use of these large-scale boat transport systems to get the 70-ton block onto the barge. They likely constructed a temporary canal right under the sledge, waiting for the peak of the Nile's annual flood to raise the water level high enough to float the boat directly beneath its cargo. Then, as the water receded, the barge would settle, taking the full weight of the stone. Egyptologists still debate the exact design and capacity of these old kingdom barges. Were they single vessels, or did they lash several boats together, to create a more stable, massive catamaran-style platform for the heaviest loads? Without the surviving plans, it's a matter of intense speculation and reverse engineering. Now the long journey north begins. For weeks, the barge and its crew would travel down the Nile, powered by the current and guided by oarsmen. Finally, after a 500-mile trip, they would arrive at the port of Giza. There, the whole process would happen in reverse. Another team of hundreds of men, the seasonal corvée laborers, would be waiting to haul the granite behemoth from the barge up a specially prepared causeway to the base of the pyramid. The journey of this single stone has taken a year, involved thousands of man-hours, and crossed the entire length of the country. And now, its biggest challenge awaits, the ascent. That 70-ton granite block, the one that traveled 500 miles from Aswan, now rests at the foot of the growing pyramid. It has arrived, its river journey complete. But its final and most daunting challenge lies directly ahead, a vertical ascent of several hundred feet. You stand beside it, craning your neck to look at the highest course of stones, where tiny figures of men move against the blue sky. Getting the millions of standard blocks up there was hard enough. Getting this monster into place seems to defy the laws of physics. There were no cranes, no helicopters, no union-approved heavy machinery. So how did they do it? Welcome to the Great Ramp Controversy, perhaps the most heated and enduring engineering debate in all of ancient history. Everyone agrees on the basic principle. They used ramps. The use of mud brick and rubble ramps is a well-documented fact from other, smaller Egyptian construction sites, like temples and mastabas. The argument isn't if they used a ramp, but what kind of ramp they built. For centuries, the popular image has been of a single, massive, linear ramp stretching from the ground straight up to the working level, growing longer and higher as the pyramid grew. This is the version you see in the movies. The problem? Physics and logistics. To maintain a workable gradient of, say, 8%, a ramp to the very top of the Great Pyramid would have had to be over a mile long. It would have contained a volume of material nearly equal to, if not greater than, the pyramid itself. It's like building an entire second pyramid just for the purpose of building the first one. It seems fantastically inefficient. So you explore another theory. What if the ramp wrapped around the pyramid like a road climbing a mountain? This is the zigzag or spiral ramp theory. The ramp would be built onto the faces of the pyramid as it rose, switching back at the corners. This solves the material problem. You'd need far less stuff to build this kind of ramp, but it creates a new one, cornering. It's the ancient Egyptian version of trying to get a sofa up a narrow flight of stairs. A standard 2.5-ton block might make the turn, but what about our 70-ton granite beam, which could be 30 feet long? There's simply no way to pivot it around a tight 90-degree corner. The geometry doesn't work. For years, this cornering problem seemed to make the external spiral ramp just as unlikely as the absurdly long straight one. This is where a French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin enters the scene. In the early 2000s, he proposed a radical and brilliant hybrid theory that has shaken up Egyptology. His quirky and compelling idea is that the Egyptians used two ramps. They started with a short, straight external ramp to build the bottom third of the pyramid, the part with the largest and heaviest volume of stones. But once they reached a height of about 140 feet, they dismantled that ramp and started building an internal one. You heard that right. Houdin proposes that for the top 2/3 of the pyramid, the workers hauled the blocks up a corkscrew ramp built inside the structure itself, just behind the outer casing stones. It would be a dark, sloping tunnel, a hidden highway inside the monument. This theory, once considered fringe, has gained serious traction. It solves the material problem and the cornering problem. Houdin suggests that the corners were left open, creating small notches on the face of the pyramid that acted as turning bays, allowing a crane-like wooden device to lift and pivot the long blocks before they were shunted into the next section of the ramp. In fact, a mysterious notch is still visible on the northeast corner of the Great Pyramid, right where Houdin's theory predicts a turning point would be. Furthermore, a microgravimetry survey conducted in the 1980s showed a strange, lower density spiral feature inside the pyramid, exactly where the internal ramp would be. It's like finding a secret passageway in a video game that was there all along. Egyptologists and engineers still argue furiously over which ramp theory, or combination of theories, is correct. Some stick to modified external ramp models, while others are championing Houdin's internal ramp. The truth may be a mix of all of them. But as you stand there, watching the men prepare the great granite block for its ascent, the debate fades into the background, replaced by a sense of awe. Whichever method they used, it required a level of planning, precision, and ingenuity that is simply breathtaking. The mystery isn't a sign of failure on their part. It's a testament to their genius. And the fact that we've been so focused on this spectacular how might just be the reason why the simpler, uglier myth about the who was allowed to survive for so long. You stand back, taking in the entire Giza complex, the three main pyramids, the enigmatic Sphinx, the cities of the living and the dead. You've journeyed through the evidence, from the bread and beer to the medical care, from the proud graffiti to the honored tombs. The image of whipped slaves has dissolved, replaced by a much more complex and human picture of skilled, organized, and respected Egyptian citizens. The evidence against the slave myth is overwhelming. It's written in the bones, carved in the stones, and buried in the sand. So why did the myth persist for so long? Why, even today, is it the first image that comes to mind for so many people? This is where we uncover the cover-up, and you realize it wasn't a single malicious act, but a slow, creeping conspiracy of bias, convenience, and historical habit. The first culprit, as we saw, was Herodotus. His dramatic tale of a cruel Khufu and a suffering population was so well written, and came from such an authoritative source, that it became the bedrock of Western history on the subject. For 2 millennia, there was simply no competing narrative. A foundational fact of historiography is that once a story is written down by a respected source, it takes an enormous amount of counter-evidence to overturn it. The written word, especially the ancient written word, carries immense authority. Without archaeology, who was going to argue with the father of history? The second accomplice in the cover-up was the Bible, by linking the suffering of the Hebrews in Egypt to the land of the pyramids. The book of Exodus created a powerful and enduring moral association. Even though the timelines are completely mismatched, as we've established, the pyramids became the de facto symbol of that enslavement. For centuries, for billions of believers, Egypt was the land of bondage, and the pyramids were its most famous landmarks. The connection was emotional and spiritual, not historical, but it was strong enough to cement the slave narrative in the cultural consciousness. It just felt right. Then came the modern era, and with it, a new set of biases. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Western archaeologists began to systematically study Egypt, they often looked at this ancient civilization through the lens of their own cultural superiority. A subtle but pervasive prejudice, what we might now call Eurocentrism, made it difficult for some to accept that an African civilization could have achieved such a feat of engineering and social organization on its own. Attributing it to the brutal power of a despot and the sweat of 1 million slaves was a simpler, more palatable explanation than acknowledging a level of sophisticated project management and social welfare that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, their own. The slave myth fit neatly into a worldview that saw history as a linear progression, with their own society at the apex. And finally, there's the simple, undeniable power of a good story. The slave myth is dramatic. It has a clear villain, the pharaoh, helpless victims, the slaves, and a backdrop of epic suffering and cruelty. The truth, a story about a well-managed civil service project, fueled by a complex system of barter, religious duty, and national pride, is far less sensational. It's a story about logistics, not liberation. It's about bread production rates, not breaking chains. As a result, Hollywood, pop culture documentaries, and even school textbooks have, until very recently, clung to the more exciting narrative. It's just easier to sell. Scholars still debate how to effectively communicate this revised, more accurate history to a public so accustomed to the old myth. It's like trying to convince people that their favorite action movie was actually a quiet documentary about accounting. So the great cover-up wasn't a shadowy cabal hiding the truth. It was history itself, shaped by the biases of its storytellers, the power of religious tradition, and our own innate love for a simple, dramatic narrative. The truth was never really hidden. It was just buried, waiting under the sand for archaeologists with trowels instead of preconceived notions. The discovery of the workers' village and cemetery in the 1990s was the key that finally unlocked the story. It gave a voice to the builders themselves, allowing the physical evidence to shout louder than 2,000 years of myth. The real story is, in the end, far more impressive. It's not a story about how one man could force 1,000,000 people to do his bidding. It's a story about how a nation, organized and motivated, could achieve the impossible together. The sun is setting now, casting long, deep purple shadows from the pyramids across the sand. The day trippers and the tour buses are gone. A profound quiet descends upon the Giza Plateau, the same quiet that has greeted the end of the day here for thousands of years. You stand one last time before the Great Pyramid, but you see it differently now. It's no longer a monument to a tyrant's ego, built on a foundation of human suffering. It is a testament to a nation's collective will, a symbol of human ingenuity and organization on an almost unimaginable scale. The stone face of the pyramid seems less a monument to a single king and more a tombstone for a generation of forgotten builders. The real builders were not slaves, nor were they aliens or members of a lost Atlantean race. They were men like many. The seasonal farmer, paying his civic dues with sweat and muscle. They were men like Patashepsu, the overseer of the artisans, a career professional who took immense pride in his work and was rewarded with an honored burial. They were the anonymous women in the bakeries and weaving workshops, whose labor formed the invisible scaffolding that held the entire project up. They were the doctors who set broken bones with a skill that still amazes us, and the boatmen who navigated the Nile's currents with 70-ton blocks of granite in their care. They were the drunkards of Menkaure and the friends of Khufu, real people with team spirit and, it seems, a sense of humor. Their names are almost all lost to us. We know them only through a few dozen titles and the faint traces of red ochre graffiti left in the pyramid's hidden chambers. The mainstream historical consensus is now firm. The pyramids were built by free Egyptian citizens. But this fact is still fighting its way out from under the shadow of the much older, more dramatic myth. The real wonder of the pyramids, you realize, isn't how the blocks were lifted, as fascinating as the ramp controversy is. The real wonder is how the society was lifted, how an entire nation was mobilized, fed, housed, medically cared for, and motivated by a shared sense of purpose and divine mission. Building the pyramid was as much an exercise in social engineering as it was in stoneworking. You reach out and touch the stone one last time. It's cool now, holding the memory of the day's heat deep within. You think of the hands that cut this block, the shoulders that pushed it, the minds that calculated its exact position. These were not the actions of people driven by fear. This was the work of participants. We will likely never know the full, intimate details of their daily lives or the precise nature of their religious beliefs. And these gaps will always provide fertile ground for scholarly debate and speculation. But the broad strokes of their story are now clear, painted not by Herodotus's gossipy tales, but by the undeniable evidence they left behind. They were pioneers of project management, masters of logistics, and artisans of breathtaking skill. They built a monument to their king, but in doing so, they also built an eternal monument to themselves, to the potential of a unified and organized people. The whispers of these real builders are all around you now, carried on the gentle desert wind. They ask not for our pity, but for our respect, Dot. So the next time you see a picture of the pyramids or hear someone mention the slaves who built them, you can allow a small knowing smile to cross your face. You can think of the city of bread and beer, the well-healed bones in their honored tombs, and the boastful names of the work gangs who tagged the inside of eternity. The true story of the pyramids is not one of oppression, but one of immense, astonishing, and deeply human achievement. A story that was covered up by time and tradition, but has finally been brought into the light, leaving us with a narrative that is perhaps less dramatic, but infinitely more inspiring as you drift now gently into your own peaceful slumber.